All right. So I want to point out that I have made I noticed last class a small typo error in the calendar of the syllabus regarding master and his emissary readings. So I've updated the syllabus. It's very small changes. Basically, I just erased. There is one additional reading that's I basically said the same chapters twice in a row to read. So I erased that and moved the other chapters up in the syllabus a little bit. And so I kept the old syllabus there for comparison, but the syllabus, which I've made a very small change, a couple changes in the calendar, called Update One, right there. Both are available on Blackboard. Update One is the one that you should now be using. It doesn't influence the lectures or doesn't influence the textbook readings. It does affect the master and emissary readings just a little bit. So today the goal is to talk about chapter 3. Maybe we should look at the syllabus. And then I guess I'll also point out, let's see, you'll have a master and his emissary reading, which is due Tuesday of the coming week. So I'll have the quiz posted probably tonight. I should have that quiz posted. So you should have several days to get this done. And it will be due late Monday night, like around 11:59 Monday night. That's when that quiz will be due. Okay, so yeah, the goal today then is chapter 3 stuff. This is a chapter we've already talked about methods a little bit in this class, and I've already showed you some data from a couple different methods. But we're going to learn in this chapter in more detail about the methods that will be provide the data and the basis for many studies that we learn about for the entire semester. So yeah, let's just get to it. So we've already talked. In fact, I think I've literally shown you this exact slide before, but I just want to remind you of this key difference here between functional neuroimaging methods, where we're measuring brain activity differences between at least two different tasks, two different mental states, EEG, MEG, fMRI, PET. To the extent that these are functional, the study will always involve at least two different conditions, and those two different conditions reflect different mental states. And then you use the functional method to compare the brain activity differences between those two different mental states. Contrasting that with structural methods, which are basically anatomical methods. We just learn about the anatomy of a given individual's brain. And for instance, CT or CAT scans are basically just like three-dimensional X-rays. And so we'll learn about, in this chapter, mostly we're going to learn about functional methods. These are the ones that are definitely most relevant to the entire course. Most studies that we'll be learning about, there's some mental task, two different conditions where participants' mental tasks are slightly different, and we're looking at brain activity differences between those two different conditions. That's the way most of the studies in this textbook will go, and that's what we're going to focus in on in this chapter. Starting with fMRI, okay, so fMRI gets pictures, produces pictures like this. And what these pictures represent, get a good place for that, but these pictures represent like this right here. Each of these little areas where there's red, orangey, yellow blobs represent regions of the brain that are more active in one mental state than the other. So remember, I said that functional studies, fMRI, the F in fMRI stands for functional. And in functional studies, we are comparing brain activity differences between two different tasks. And those two different tasks basically represent two different mental states. And these little blobs on these brains here, they represent those regions of the brain where brain activity was more for one mental task compared to the other. So these blobs always represent differences in activation between at least two conditions. And so fMRI, the way it works in more detail than we've talked about now, is kind of these series of bullets up here. I guess I should point out that fMRI has kind of been around for about 40 years now. Came about in approximately the 80s. And then it started to become pretty popular in the 90s. And there are more universities started getting fMRI machines. Research increased gradually. Now there's a whole lot of fMRI research which is being conducted. So how does it work? As the name implies, the F stands for functional. It's functional magnetic resonance imaging is what this stands for. F is for functional. The M is for magnetic, and that's because the magnetism is an important part of how fMRI works. So you can see an fMRI machine right here. A participant or a patient lays inside on this bed, and then their head goes inside this area right here. And then this machine right here, obviously, it's going to contain a lot of different technological things, but one of the things it contains is a strong magnet. In fact, if you've ever been in an fMRI room, you've been asked to take off all of the metal on yourself, and then you've probably also been asked if you have metal inside of yourself. So some people will have like metal rods implanted if they broke a bone and had a serious bone break, or other reasons you might have metal implanted inside your body. The magnet in fMRI is very strong, and it could hurt an individual. If you have metal inside your body and then you go into the room with this strong fMRI magnet on, then it could cause major problems, such as basically the metal which is in your body being pulled towards the magnet, which would obviously be a problem. So fMRI machines use magnetism. And basically what they're doing, the magnets are useful, and I'll tell you exactly how, in measuring oxygenated hemoglobin. So we're not going to go into the biology of metabolism in detail here, but I will say that that in blood, blood can either be oxygenated or deoxygenated. When you breathe in, that causes oxygen to go to your blood. When you and then until you breathe in again, the blood loses the oxygen and becomes deoxygenated temporarily until it gets oxygenated again when you get more oxygen into your system. Hemoglobin is a molecule which is in blood. And fMRI measures basically the amount of oxygenated hemoglobin compared to the amount of deoxygenated hemoglobin, which is in the blood at a given region of the brain. And the assumption here is that those regions of the brain which are most active are going to have a lot of oxygenated hemoglobin. So the way this works is that there's your brain is inside your whole body, including your brain, is inside this little tunnel looking thing right here. And a magnetic pulse is applied. And what it does is it causes the oxygenated hemoglobin molecules that are in your brain to line up across the magnetic pulse, or a magnetic field. So imagine back to elementary school or maybe junior high, when you would have the iron filings, and then you would put a magnet underneath them, and then all the iron filings would line up in those nice little curving rows. And so you apply a magnet, and hemoglobin is weakly magnetic, and so it will line up into these magnetic fields. But then a radio wave pulse is sent in the direction of inside the tunnel, and this perturbs the alignment of the oxygenated hemoglobin. So the way to think about this is there's like a line of hemoglobin molecules, and then a radio wave pulse is sent, which will kind of move the individual members of the magnetic field. The oxygenated hemoglobin was lined up, but then the radio wave is sent to perturb the line, how the hemoglobin is lined up. And so there'll be a disalignment, a temporary disalignment of the oxygenated hemoglobin as a result of this radio wave that is sent. But then the radio wave is turned off, and then this causes things to line back up again. So at the beginning, all the hemoglobin is lined up nicely because of the magnet. The oxygenated hemoglobin is lined up nicely. Then the radio wave pulse is sent, which causes temporary disalignment, and then the radio wave is turned back off, and then things line up again. It says right here, oxygenated hemoglobin molecules will line back up again with the magnetic field when the radio wave is turned off. And the physics of this basically means that when the oxygenated hemoglobin is returning back to the magnetic field, that it releases energy. And this is the energy which is detected by the fMRI machine. The more oxygenated hemoglobin you have in a given region of the brain, the more it's going to snap back into place onto that magnetic field when the radio wave is turned off. The more it snaps back into place of the magnetic field, the more energy that is released, the more, then that means you'll have like a darker region, or that'll be a picture on these brains right here. That'll be one of the blobs where there's a lot of activity. It will be a region, a place where there's a lot of oxygenated hemoglobin. And when that oxygenated hemoglobin returns back to the magnetic field, it releases a lot of energy. And that energy is what is detected by the fMRI machine. So this is a term I'm pretty sure I asked you a question about for the quiz that was due this morning for chapter 3. This term bold applies primarily to fMRI, though I think you would be safe to use that for PET as well, positron emission tomography, which we'll talk about in a second. And a blood oxygen level dependent. That's the bold response, or the bold signal, is what each of these blobs is. Once again, they're tied to the amount of oxygenated hemoglobin in any given region of the brain. So that's why it says oxygen level dependent. Each of these signals is basically measuring the amount of oxygen in the blood in any given region of the brain. Okay, so the next imaging method here, another functional imaging method, is positron emission tomography. In my mind, fMRI and PET they obviously are different in the way they work, but they have a lot in common in the sense that what the data looks like when they're done. Just like fMRI, when you use a PET scan, even the machine itself looks somewhat similar for PET scan. It's a big tunnel. Once again, you lay down and put your brain inside. And PET's also similar to fMRI in the sense that it will give you pictures of the brain with different regions of activity. And what that activity basically represents in PET is metabolic activity. It says here, metabolic processes. So the way PET works is that a radioactive molecule is injected. There's actually a lot of different ones that can be injected, a lot of different radioactive tracers, but oxygen is common, at least in cognitive neuroscience. So radioactive oxygen is inserted into a person's body, and it's radioactive. And so what this means is that when that oxygen goes somewhere in the person's body, that the radioactivity that was connected to the oxygen will start to accumulate in these various parts of the body. The parts of the body that are using a lot of oxygen, they're going to have accumulation of the radioactive tracer, because the radioactive tracer is connected to the oxygen, and the oxygen goes somewhere in your body, and then the radioactivity kind of accumulates to wherever most of the oxygen in your body is going. And then the machine itself, it's detecting an aspect of the radiation, gamma rays, and the kind of the information that you get from PET is pretty similar to what you get from fMRI. Once again, you basically get information about what regions of the brain are using the most oxygen right now. Those regions of the brain that are using the most oxygen are going to have the most radiation, and the radiation can be tested by the PET machine, the positron emission tomography machine. Questions or comments so far about fMRI versus PET scan? All right, let us continue. EEG. So this is one that it's the one that I am probably most knowledgeable about, is EEG. And the 625 course that I teach, obviously during the quarantine, things are a little bit different, but in the past, doing EEG studies is actually a pretty common. We do at least one, maybe two different EEG studies in 625 course that all neuroscience majors have to take at some point. As I said, it's different during the quarantine because we can't actually, we have to social distance, so we can't be doing electrodes on each other. So we're doing other studies. Usually, though, we do a lot of EEG, and I've also published some studies about EEG as well. So EEG is definitely giving us different information about what's going on in the brain compared to fMRI or PET. I haven't said this about PET or fMRI. Basically, PET and fMRI give us very good information about where the activity in the brain is occurring. So I would call that good spatial resolution. This is PET and fMRI have good spatial resolution. But PET and fMRI do not have particularly good temporal resolution. So when you see those pictures of those blobs on the pictures on the brains that I showed you earlier, that represents metabolic activity that's occurred over the span of several seconds. We don't know within each of those seconds when the metabolic activity is occurring. We just know over the span of, we'll say, 4 to 10 seconds, there was activity in this brain region and this brain region and this brain region, and it was, higher than the metabolic activity in surrounding brain regions. So fMRI, PET, good spatial resolution. They know, where the stuff is occurring, but you don't know exactly when it occurred. Contrasting that with EEG, which is basically just the opposite. EEG is a method where we use electrodes that are placed on the person's scalp, and you get from these measure the electrical activity, which is presumably coming from the brain. But the electrodes, this technique does not allow the researchers to know with certainty where the electrical signals are coming from. So related to the way that the skull kind of disrupts the information which is coming up from inside the brain, it's very difficult using electrodes that are implanted on top of the scalp to determine where in the brain it's coming from. So if you get a big electrical signal over here, maybe you can assume with some pretty high confidence that the signal it's reaching these left electrodes is coming probably from the left hemisphere of the brain. But it's also possible with a smaller probability that signal could actually be coming from the right side of the brain and just traveling over to this left hemisphere electrode. So you don't really know. A given electrode is picking up some electrical activity coming from the brain, but you don't actually know where in the brain that signal is coming from. So EEG has bad spatial resolution because we don't really know where the electrical signals are coming from, but it has really good temporal resolution. So EEG can basically detect differences in electrical activity that are occurring on the order of milliseconds, like fractions of a second. EEG can tell very fine-tuned differences in the electrical activity that are occurring over sub-second point, amount of time, like milliseconds. Like, sometimes you'll see studies where they're zoning in on like a 5 millisecond period of time and looking at electrical differences between, once again, two mental states. But they'll zone in on like 5 millisecond point in time and then look at how the electrical activity differs between two conditions, between two different mental states, just for like a 5 millisecond point in time. So we're talking about very high temporal resolution, but not very good spatial resolution. So this is definitely a technique that I'll be talking about frequently throughout the course. And I wanted to talk about kind of the two ways of approaching data analysis with EEG. One is called frequency analysis. And this is when you you get frequency analysis, each electrode on the person's scalp is measuring electrical activity. You get a little trace, and I'll actually show you a video here in a second where you can see a trace on an electrode that's being created as the machine is recording the electrical activity. You can see kind of the electrical trace, which is coming from a given electrode. Frequency analysis is breaking down that trace into its different sinusoidal components. So this actually is probably a good time. Let's see if this video, here we go. Let's see how this one works. Good. Um, it's in the slides as well, so if you want to just watch it on your own, it's about 1 minute that we'll be watching this video. So I'll start it now. Nope. Here's the trace right here. I have one electrode on my head in this video. You can't see it. I'm just wearing that hat.
Eyes open.
And let me say, Alex, who was one of my assistants previously, she is instructing me when she says eyes open, eyes closed, eyes open, eyes closed. What she's doing is she's wanting to measure brain activity differences depending on whether my eyes are open or whether my eyes are closed. Those are the two different conditions. You could call those, in this case, two different mental states. The idea is that when your eyes are open, your brain is fully turned on and it's welcoming new incoming information and processing it. When your eyes are closed, the evidence pretty strongly indicates that your brain kind of shuts down just a little bit. It's kind of like in sleep mode when your eyes are closed. And there's definitely differences in what the brain is doing, depending on whether your eyes are open or whether your eyes are closed. And I'll tell you a little bit about what those differences are here. They concern this idea that I'm trying to illustrate, frequency analysis. Each of these markers, you're going to see these little arrows right here. Each of these markers represents a condition. And what we're doing is we measure the activity that occurs during that condition, and then we group all of the similar conditions, that is eyes open, into a single average, and then we'll group all the other condition, the eyes closed, into a single average, and then we'll compare the EEG response between those two. So I'll keep on going here. Oh wait, you can't hear it because I'm not sharing the share the sound. Okay, let's try this again.
Eyes closed. Eyes open. Eyes closed. Eyes open. You're done.
Okay.
Okay. So once again, a single electrode, and this is just a trace. This is the electrical activity, the electrical fluctuations that are occurring in my brain throughout the course of this 30-second session. That's all. We took 30 seconds worth of data. This is when my eyes were open. This is when my eyes were closed. This is when my eyes were open. This is when my eyes were closed once again. And this is the end of the experiment. We don't care about that data. We're going to take this and take an average. That's the eyes open averaged. And this is, take this and this right here. This is the condition where my eyes were closed. You guys could hear her saying eyes open, eyes closed, right? Were you able to hear that?
Yeah.
Good. Thank you. So that's what these little things right here, these are the markers, and they indicate the different conditions. Once again, eyes open, eyes closed, eyes open, eyes closed. I think I'll probably come back to that here in a second. So now I want to talk about frequency analysis, because I just showed you that trace, and that trace was what would be known as like just the raw EEG signal. And you notice how it had all those little, those little up and, just the trace was kind of going up and down really quickly. There's all those little, it kind of looked similar to this. But frequency analysis is the idea that you take that trace, that's the raw electrical activity, the raw data, the raw information about the electrical activity in my brain, and you apply frequency analysis. And what frequency analysis is doing is looking at the various sinusoidal components which compose that trace that you just saw being created in the video. And there's low frequency information in that trace that you just saw, which would be called delta activity. And delta activity would be like slow waves that are kind of embedded in that trace. They're not always easy to see with the naked eye, but you can use basically mathematical calculations which are performed by computers. they could take that initial electrical trace and say, inside that trace, we detected a slow moving delta wave with some amplitude. Amplitude is basically how big, the size of the delta of the slow moving aspect of the wave. And then you can go to theta, which you can take that initial trace and you break it up to theta. Theta is basically a wave which moves a little bit faster. It has a frequency of around 4 to 7 hertz. Delta has a frequency of that's slow, like 0 to 4 hertz. Theta has a frequency of 4 to 7 hertz. And hertz, by the way, is basically the amount of cycles per second. So the amount of up and down motion of a given wave that's embedded in that trace, the amount of up and down motion per second. 0 to 4 is slow, 4 to 7 is relatively faster. There's also alpha, which is 8 to 12, which is kind of in the middle of the road. 8 to 12 repetitions per second. Beta, which is 12 to 30 repetitions per second. And then gamma, which is basically the highest you'll find anyone ever talking about in the brain, where there's 30 to 100 waves per second, which is a lot. 100 waves per second means basically a peak and trough every 10 milliseconds, which is a fraction, 100th of a second. So gamma, the waves are going really, really fast inside that EEG trace. In theta or delta, the waves are moving very slowly inside that EEG trace. So with frequency analysis, you're taking that initial EEG trace that I showed you in the video, that's the raw data, and you're filtering the data and you're saying, how many delta waves, what is the amplitude of the delta waves which are in that trace? What is the amplitude of the theta waves that were in that trace? What is the amplitude of the alpha, beta, and gamma waves that were in that trace that we just recorded from? And the finding that we are able to show quite consistently in my psyc375 class, and it's one of the, a very highly known finding in neuroscience, is that when your eyes are closed, alpha amplitude gets big. And when your eyes are open, alpha amplitude gets small. So I want to actually go back to the video, show a little bit more. Okay, so let's watch a tiny bit more.
Eyes open, eyes closed, eyes open, eyes closed. It's always that one that's the biggest.
So what I hopefully you'll be able to see this, but if not, I'll kind of highlight your attention to some of things. We have this set so that when I just clicked OK, and you saw me, it asked me that question a second ago, and then I pressed OK, the program automatically decomposes that original EEG trace. We had that one electrode that was measuring my brain activity back here in my occipital, coming from my occipital lobe, presumably. I pressed OK, and then the computer program knows to automatically decompose that EEG trace into the different sinusoidal components, and you can see them here. Here is the alpha component right here. So this is my the taking that initial EEG wave and then breaking it down into the alpha waves, which are middle of the road frequency. Here's beta, which is a high frequency component. Here's delta, which is a low frequency component, and then theta, which is on the low side. Delta is the lowest, theta is the second lowest frequency wave. And then you can look at those same conditions and you can look at, does alpha amplitude, does it vary depending on whether my eyes are open or whether my eyes are closed? And if you actually see here, one of the reasons I like this effect so much is that it's so strong in the alpha in the way the eyes open, eyes closed influences your alpha amplitude that you can physically see it just by looking at the traces. So here's when my eyes are open. This is alpha right here. And you can see that this is pretty low. When your eyes are open, alpha amplitude is low. Here is when my eyes were closed, and you can see the traces are a little bit taller here. My alpha amplitude increased when my eyes were closed. Once again, I open my eyes, the alpha amplitude gets smaller again. And then I close my eyes again, and the alpha amplitude increases. And remembering, let's go back. And remembering that alpha amplitude is kind of a medium frequency. We take that initial EEG trace, decompose it into its different sinusoidal components. One sinusoidal component, the alpha frequency right in the middle, is strongly modulated by things like whether your eyes are open or whether your eyes are closed. When your eyes are open, alpha amplitude is small. When your eyes are closed, alpha amplitude actually gets bigger. Similarly, beta and gamma, these are the high frequency components. They're moving really, really fast in that EEG trace. Generally, they're bigger when you are awake and when you're attentive. And so when you're starting to get tired and when you're starting to get sleepy, when your eyes are closed, beta and gamma actually get smaller. So when your eyes are closed, the low frequencies tend to get more pronounced. When you're tired, when you're sluggish, when your eyes are closed, the low frequencies, their amplitude increases, whereas the high frequencies get quieter. And just the opposite happens when your eyes are open. When your eyes are open, the low frequencies, they get reduced in amplitude, whereas the high frequencies become more pronounced, which to me makes a whole lot of sense. You would associate wakefulness with your brain is kind of doing this. And that's the case. When you're awake, the high frequencies are most active. And when your eyes are shut and when you're, kind of tired, the low frequencies are most active in your brain. And so this is something I usually talk about in intro psych, but it really kind of helps hit home some of these ideas about how different frequency bands correspond to different mental states. So looking at the different stages of sleep, awake but getting calm, and then actually entering sleep. And there's these changes that occur where different frequencies become more pronounced depending on which stage of wakefulness and sleep you are. When you're awake, the common idea is that gamma and the here shown beta waves, these are the two high frequencies, are most prominent. But as you start to get calm, the alpha waves become more prominent. Alpha waves are kind of a middle frequency. When you actually enter sleep, like stage 1, theta waves, which is getting on the low side, that's the second lowest frequency that we've talked about, start to get more prominent. And then when we finally get down to stage 3 and 4, delta waves, which are the lowest frequency wave, those become most prominent in very deep sleep. And I guess I should define deepness of sleep. Basically, deepness of sleep is how hard it would be. Usually deepness of sleep is defined as how hard it would be to wake up a person given the stage of sleep that they're in. So it's relatively easy to wake up a person when they're in stage 1. It is relatively more difficult to wake up a person when they're in stages 3 and 4. The deeper the sleep, the harder it is to wake up the person. And in general, you can see that the deeper the sleep, the lower the frequency that is the most dominant frequency. In stages 3 and 4, the low frequency delta is most prominent. But there's a very interesting exception to this rule, which is REM, rapid eye movement sleep. This is the deepest stage of sleep in the sense that in REM sleep, this is when it's most difficult to wake a person up. REM sleep is usually when a person is dreaming, and this is the type of sleep where you might have to move them hard to actually get them to wake up, and then that's when they'll probably be a little surprised when you're waking them up. So REM sleep, very deep sleep. But what's interesting about REM sleep is that if you look at the EEG trace during REM sleep, the EEG trace most resembles the EEG trace when a person is awake. So what this means is in REM sleep, the frequencies which are most prominent are like beta, which is it's the second highest frequency band that I showed you in the previous slide. A lot of high frequency activity when you are in REM sleep, but that's a little bit odd because you're in very deep sleep. Usually deep sleep, the low frequencies are dominant, but REM sleep, which is sometimes called paradoxical sleep, is a stage of deep sleep where the high frequencies are most prominent. So it's kind of this interesting, what's going on here. But if you think about it, it kind of makes a little bit of sense. REM is when you're dreaming, and dreaming is kind of like being conscious a little bit, like you're not completely conscious, but you're conscious of something while you're dreaming. And when you're dreaming, you kind of feel like what you're experiencing is real sometimes. And so when you're actually awake and conscious, you have a lot of high frequency activity. Whoops. And when you're in REM, you're not technically conscious, but your dreams kind of feel like they're conscious. The neural correlates, or what's going on in your brain, kind of resembles the very thing that occurs when you are conscious. That is a lot of high frequency activity, even though indeed this is actually a very low This is a very deep stage of sleep where it's hard to wake a person up. Yeah. Okay, so I told you a little bit about sleep just so you can understand how the different frequency bands kind of map on to different stages, the different amounts of wakefulness. Generally, when you're highly awake, the high frequency bands will be most prominent. And when you're in deep sleep, the low frequency bands will be most prominent, with the exception of REM sleep, which is paradoxical, which is when you're very, very deep sleep, but there's a lot of high frequency activity, which is prominent in your EEG. In general, I want us to get a good sense, and we'll see some actual specific examples as we go through this course. Again, we'll get a general sense of the type of information, the type of studies that occur using the EEG method. And so these are just some examples. And the thing that I want you to kind of remember about all these functional methods, EEG being one of them, is you're always comparing brain activity between at least two conditions. And what those two conditions represent are different mental states. And so in the example I just gave you, it was eyes open versus eyes closed. Eyes open is like the engaged mental state, whereas eyes closed is like the not engaged, not attentive mental state. Some other things that I've seen EEG studies, a common kind of paradigm would be presenting people with words in the language that they speak, their native language, and then looking at what the brain does compared to words in a foreign language, words that they don't understand. What is the differences in brain activity electrically, depending on whether a person understands the word that they're hearing or doesn't understand the word that they're hearing. And also the difference between upright faces versus inverted faces. So it turns out that the brain is particularly good at recognizing these faces when they're in the upright, like this, orientation. And if you took my head and you presented it upside down like this, the brain responds almost as though it's not looking at a face at all. It's kind of like the brain only classifies something which is a face as being a face if it's presented in the upright orientation. If you take that face and put it upside down, the brain acts as though it's not a face at all anymore. How does the brain differentiate between an upright and an inverted face? What is the differences in those electrical activity look like? These are just another, the three different examples of the type of studies that you could do. This is a functional method where you're comparing two different mental states, at least two different mental states, comparing the electrical activity between those two different mental states. Just to make sure that we're comfortable with this idea of different frequency bands, I'm presenting you, we've talked about delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma, taking that raw EEG signal and decomposing it into those different sinusoidal components. I just want to make sure that we're exactly clear as to what this means. This involves something known as Fourier analysis, which is basically a mathematical technique. You don't have to know any of the mathematics of Fourier analysis, but I do want you to understand what Fourier analysis does. It's kind of doing what I've already been saying. It's taking that complex waveform, that's the raw EEG signal that you saw being created while in that video, that the trace that was being drawn as I was opening and closing my eyes. That's the complex waveform. And for instance, that would be this thing right here. This represents a complex waveform. Fourier analysis is taking that complex waveform and decomposing it like this into those different sinusoidal components. So taking this component, this complex waveform right here, it's got these low frequency component right here, but it also has like a middle or high frequency component here. And so you could decompose it, and they kind of did it three different waves here. This is the low frequency component, like these big movements right here. And then they have a middle frequency component and then a high frequency component. And you can see the plus signs, low frequency plus middle frequency plus high frequency. You put them all together and you get the complex waveform again. You take the complex waveform, you can decompose it into each of these different components, the low frequency, middle frequency, and high frequency component. That's what is meant by frequency analysis. So this might map onto like delta, this might map onto like alpha, and this might map onto like beta or gamma. Low frequency, middle frequency, high frequency. This is the complex waveform where all of those different frequencies are combined into a single trace. Any questions or comments about EEG or frequency analysis? Okay. So event-related potentials are a special type of data analysis that is used when you're using the EEG technology. So by definition, EEG technology is just using electrodes placed on the scalp to measure electrical activity, which is coming from the brain. That's what EEG is at its core. Electrodes placed on the scalp measuring electrical activity from the brain. One way of analyzing the data with EEG is to use Fourier analysis to break that complex waveform down into its different sinusoidal components and then compare the amplitude of at least one of those components between two different mental states, between two different conditions. Another way of analyzing EEG data is to not apply a Fourier analysis. That is, look at the raw EEG data itself without filtering it, without decomposing it into those different sinusoidal components. And this is most of the time when people are talking about event-related potentials or ERPs, this is what they're talking about. Use the EEG method, electrodes placed on the scalp to measure electrical activity from the brain. You present at least two stimuli, like in this study, people are presented with either pictures of faces or they're presented with pictures of cars. And they want to know in this study, how does the brain differ in its responses to faces compared to cars? And in this study, they're not applying any type of Fourier analysis. So they're not breaking things down into the sinusoidal components. They're just looking at that raw EEG waveform, the complex waveform. And they're looking in this particular study at a specific point in time, 170 milliseconds after the onset of one of these two types of pictures. So at zero time point right here, people are either presented with a picture of a face or they're presented with a picture of car right here at the zero time point. And then if you go to the right, this is time in milliseconds. And about 170 milliseconds, there's this difference in the electrical activity between these two conditions. The light trace right here, this is the brain's response to cars. And then faces, the dark trace is the response to faces that occurs right here. And you can see there's a difference. There's really not a difference before 170 milliseconds. Before 170 milliseconds, the brain's response to cars and faces are the same. But I guess the way you could think about this is it basically takes the brain 170 milliseconds to be like, oh, there's a difference between these two things. And the brain responds this way when it's looking at at a face. The dark trace is the face. And it looks this way when it's looking at the car. The lighter trace is the car. So there's this difference in electrical activity that occurs about 170 milliseconds after the presentation of a given object. And this difference here, they call the N170. It is a event-related potential, which has been most strongly studied with respect to faces, because with faces, that is the dark trace, you get this big negativity. That's what the N stands for, by the way. And it's a negativity because if you look at the y-axis, the y-axis is basically amplitude measured in microvolts. It doesn't say microvolts here, but it is. The measure is usually microvolts. And positivity is on the upside. Negativity is on the downside, negative, positive, at least in this picture. Sometimes they do flip it. And so negative will be up and positive will be down. In this one, though, positive is up, negative is down. And for the faces, there's a strong negativity that occurs 170 milliseconds after the faces is presented. For cars, there's also a negativity, but that negativity is significantly weaker than the negativity that occurs for faces. So this is the N170 event-related potential. Each of these traces represents the electrical activity that has not been Fourier analyzed. It's just the raw EEG signal without being decomposed into the different sinusoidal components. The N stands for negativity, and 170 stands for milliseconds. Negativity because it's going onto the negative side, 170 because if you look at the time point, it's 170 milliseconds after the presentation of the stimulus, which is either a face or a car. 170 milliseconds after the presentation, there's a big negativity for faces and a relatively smaller negativity for cars. So presumably this negativity for the faces has something to do with how the brain could detect a face and be like, oh, this is a special thing that deserves a special type of processing, a special type of mental state when I'm looking at a face compared to when I'm looking at a car when there's a different type of mental state. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the EEG method, and we talked about Fourier analysis, which looks at the different sinusoidal components compared to event-related potentials, which typically will just look at the raw complex waveform. That's EEG, which measures electrical activity from on top of the scalp. A somewhat similar method, though much more costly, and I would also argue more difficult to use, is MEG, which also measures information which is coming from inside the brain, and it measures it from outside the skull. All of these measures that we've talked about we're not usually sticking probes into people's brains through their skull, so we're always having to measure brain activity from outside the skull. MEG is measuring basically a magnetic field which is generated from electrical activity inside the brain, and it does so from outside the skull. It's pretty similar actually to EEG in the sense that it has good temporal resolution. EEG, I've already mentioned, you get information about with millisecond precision with EEG. With MEG, you also get really good temporal resolution. MEG, though, out of all of these methods, it's probably the best balance of temporal and spatial precision. It's got a pretty good balance of both. It definitely has unambiguously good temporal precision, MEG does. But unlike EEG, EEG has bad spatial precision. With EEG, you don't know where really in the brain those signals are coming from. MEG, though, it actually is a little bit more easily done to localize in the brain where given electromagnetic fluctuations are coming from. And the book makes the argument this is because the magnetic field is not as strongly distorted by the skull. Electrical fields are strongly distorted by the skull, making it very difficult to localize them in the brain, whereas magnetic fields from electrical activity occurring in the brain are not as distorted, so we can localize them in the brain a little bit better. So MEG arguably is the most well-rounded method, though it's also very expensive. To my knowledge, there's nothing like that. For instance, at KU's campus, it's expensive. The equipment itself is expensive. Each time you use the equipment, it's expensive. And so it's not particularly common. EEG is very common because it's pretty cheap and it's pretty good. MEG is better, I would say, than EEG, but it's not particularly common just because of the price and because of it's difficult to use. Okay, so we've been talking about those 4 functional methods. All of them are used in humans and to measure what's going on in the brain, but you're doing it in a not invasive way. You know, with EEG, fMRI, PET, MEG, we're measuring stuff on the outside of the skull, and we're making inferences about what's going on inside the brain. And so those are all well suited for humans, but there actually is a lot of neuroscience research which doesn't concern humans at all. In fact, some of the most powerful research involves animals. And the basic idea is that where in humans it's unethical to, for research purposes alone, stick an electrode directly into the person's brain. With rats and even sometimes monkeys, although less common with monkeys, the researchers they'll take a research subject, a rat, and they'll do a surgery. And you can see on these rats here, they have these things which have been implanted into their heads. What the researchers do is, they'll give the shot of some anesthetic, which will put the animal to sleep. And then usually they'll shave off the top of its head. And then they'll drill holes into its skull while it's asleep. And then they'll insert probes, and then they'll place cement around the probes, and that cement will dry. And then later on, they can stick electrodes through those probes, and then they can measure electrical activity, which is coming directly from the brain. The electrode is placed directly into the brain in these animals. And then you can give the animals kind of two different mental states, or you can put the animal in two different environments, or that you can show them a picture of a predator compared to a picture of like a conspecific, meaning another rat. And you can look at how does the electrical activity in these regions of this region of the brain differ in these animals. And when you're doing single cell or multi-unit recordings, the electrodes are placed directly into the brain. So this is something that you don't do in humans unless you have a medical reason to do it, and that's pretty rare. The most common dependent variable in these studies is just that you're actually measuring the action potentials of individual neurons. If you're doing multi-unit activity, the multi-unit basically implies that you're measuring the activity of multiple neurons simultaneously, the amount of action potentials of multiple neurons simultaneously, versus single cell when you're looking at just a single neuron, or maybe a small set of neurons that are adjacent to each other in a specific part of the brain. And we're looking at the rate of action potentials. The amount of action potentials is typically the dependent variable. And we'll definitely see some studies later on where they're using presumably electrodes placed directly into an animal's head. We'll definitely see some of those in future chapters. Okay, so more methods. We'll actually talk about lesion studies plenty throughout the course of this course, because lesion studies are some of the most powerful ones in all of cognitive neuroscience. The basic idea is that in a lesion study, we want to understand how a given region of the brain works. And we want to understand specifically how that region of the brain works as far as behavior. What does that region of the brain do for a person's behavior? How does that region of the brain influence a person's thinking? And the basic logic of lesion studies is that a person's brain is intact and they behave one way, but then they might have damage that occurs to that region of the brain, which is going to cause which is going to cause some change in the behavior. And you can make a causal attribution, like this region of the brain causes this behavior, is if when the brain region is intact, they behave one way. The brain region becomes damaged and they behave a different way, then you could say, oh, this brain region must be causing so-and-so behavior. So for instance, a good example, Phineas Gage, the guy that had the railroad spike, who impaled his head, it damaged his frontal lobe. And so his left frontal lobe in particular was damaged. And then after that, he had impulse control problems. Like he would tell off people who were like, that he should have been subordinate. He'd tell off his boss, which would be, not a good thing to do. He would, swear and say bad words at inappropriate times. He lost his impulse control because his left frontal lobe was damaged. Before the damage, his frontal lobe worked fine. He had good impulse control. After the frontal lobe was destroyed, all of a sudden he would say things at inappropriate times, things that would make people kind of look sideways at him. And it made the researchers claim, okay, so this frontal lobe, this left frontal lobe at least, seems to be important for impulse control. So we're making a causal attribution. The frontal lobe causes impulse control. And I want to contrast that. A common criticism of fMRI, EEG, MEG, PET is that they provide correlational data only. That's kind of the typical, you'd say like the downside of these is they provide correlational data. A person is in these different mental states in these functional imaging methods. We can see maybe for fMRI or PET what regions of the brain are activated in this mental state compared to this mental state. But the main criticism of this is that it's correlational in nature. Compared to lesion studies, which the main advantage of these is that they provide so-called causal information. We can actually say the frontal lobe causes impulse control. Just seeing in an fMRI study that a person's frontal lobe is more activated when they're engaged in a impulse control task that's correlational evidence. But if a person's frontal lobe is damaged and then you see that their impulse control changes as a result, that allows you to make a causal assertion. At least that's the typical explanation for the advantages of lesion methods compared to functional neuroimaging. Lesion studies can provide causal information. So some common causes of Lesions would be surgical removal or surgical destruction or ablation of a given brain region. Probably the most common will be lesions due to like traumatic brain injury, or maybe some type of a disease or stroke. And then also there are some situations now because of new technologies where you can actually cause artificial lesions using stimulation. I don't want to get too ahead of myself because I'll be talking about this in more detail, but I kind of think of this as kind of like you can make a person, like when you sit like this for too long and then your hand falls asleep for a while, it's kind of like your hand is turned off or your arm is turned off for several minutes until the blood starts to circulate again. But then your hand is fine. So it's kind of turned off for a couple of minutes and like you can't really feel things while it's asleep and it's all tingly. But then if you kind of do this for a little bit, it comes back and everything's fine. There are artificial lesion techniques for the brain, which are kind of like make the brain fall asleep in a specific region for like a minute or so. And then you look, how does the person's behavior change when this one region of the brain is asleep kind of temporarily? That's what is meant by artificial lesions or artificial stimulation. Let's see, where are we? Yeah, this is a good place. We don't have too much left in this chapter. I'll finish chapter 3 next time. I do plan on having an in-class discussion activity next time where I'll give you some points for it. But yeah, that's all I have for today. If anyone wants to stick around, chat, ask me questions, I'm happy to do so. Otherwise, I will see you Tuesday.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good one.
You too. Thanks.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Bye.